Elite Romans ate until they were sick, then forced themselves to vomit just so they could keep feasting. Some even died from it. That's how deadly their luxury got. By the way, before we get too deep into this, what time is it where you are? And what country are you watching from? I love seeing how far this story travels. Congratulations, you've just been invited to a Roman banquet. Forget chairs, forget grabbing a plate for yourself. You're about to eat in a way that screams, this is not dinner, this is theatre. Step inside the triclinium. That's the fancy Latin word for banquet room. Picture 3 couches shaped like a giant U around a low table stacked with dishes. No one is sitting upright, everyone is lying down on their left elbow, eating sideways with their right hand like it's the most natural thing in the world. Romans thought sitting to eat was childish. If you wanted to be taken seriously, you lounged. The room itself, it's a showpiece. Frescoes of gods, battles, or bizarre patterns stare down at you from the walls. The floor is covered in mosaics that probably took some poor craftsman years to complete. Lamps flicker in the corners, throwing light that makes the gold cups glimmer and the silver dishes flash. The host didn't pick this setup because it was comfortable. He picked it to scream, I'm richer than you'll ever be. Here's the kicker. Even the smell is curated. Slaves are burning incense and perfumes to cover up the stench of cooked meat and sweaty bodies. You don't just breathe smoke, you breathe status. And if you're wondering who's running around to make this illusion work, it's an army of slaves carrying trays, adjusting couches, pouring wine, and waiting for the next disaster. Now let me explain something most people don't know. A Roman banquet wasn't just a dinner, it was a power move. Every detail, the guest list, the order of dishes, the kind of cups on the table, it all was part of the host flex. You weren't just eating, you were being measured. Who you sat next to, what portion landed on your plate, even the way a servant poured your wine, it all told you exactly how much or how little you mattered. Seating was brutal. The most honored guest sat close to the host in the king spot. If you were shoved to the far end of the couch row, everyone knew you were low on the social ladder. Imagine showing up and realizing your status because of which cushion your butt touched. And here's the sick twist. You didn't get to pick what you ate. The food came in waves, but not everyone got the same share. Senators and VIPs got the fat roast boar with dripping sauce. Lower-ranked guests might get fish bones or watery veggies. Think of it as a live scoreboard of your importance, and everyone in the room is keeping tally. Even the invitations were weapons. You didn't just invite friends, you invited allies, rivals, daters, and people you wanted under your thumb. Getting that invite was both an honor and a trap. Refuse and you insult the host. Accept and you owe him a public display of loyalty. Every bite of food came with strings attached. Let me give you the vibe. Imagine reclining sideways, trying to look relaxed while balancing wine, food, and conversation. Slaves hover, ready to mop up spills or refill your cup before you notice it's empty. Music plays, maybe a lyre, maybe flutes, while someone recites poetry or acts out a little drama in the corner. It's dinner, politics, and a variety show rolled into one. And the wine? Always mixed with water. Drinking it straight marked you as uncivilized, like some barbarian. But don't be fooled, it still flowed non-stop. Cups were raised in toasts, jokes flew across the room, and behind every laugh was a calculation. Is this host powerful enough that I should laugh harder than I mean it? The crazy part, all this luxury didn't mean relaxation. Guests were on display just as much as the silver plates. If you cracked a joke that fell flat, if you got sloppy drunk, if you didn't know how to handle yourself, you could ruin your reputation in a single night. A banquet was as dangerous as the Senate floor, just with better lighting and more food. And the food, let's talk about that. Romans prized novelty. Imported spices from India, oysters shipped across seas, exotic birds that nobody in the city could normally afford. One course might be stuffed dormice, the next a dish swimming in sauce made from fermented fish guts. You didn't just taste wealth, you tasted the reach of Rome itself, the empire in bite-sized form. But here's where it gets funny. While all this excess was happening, some philosophers like Seneca sat in their villas ranting about how these dinners were proof that Rome was rotting from the inside. And maybe they were right, because the whole system ran on appearances. If your host looked generous, if the guests looked loyal, then the night was a success, even if half the food got thrown up later so people could keep eating. Lighting mattered too. Oil lamps in niches or carried by slaves threw a glow that made everything look a little dreamlike. Add the smell of incense and the hum of conversation, and you're basically in a sensory trap. Every sight, smell, and sound reminded you, this is Rome and this is power. Now, picture the slaves again. They're invisible and vital at the same time. They serve the food, fan the air, carry torches, and make sure the whole event doesn't collapse. Nobody praises them, nobody looks them in the eye, but without them, the performance fails. The contrast is brutal. One person lies on a couch, nibbling imported figs. Another spends the night sprinting around with a tray, knowing one mistake could mean a beating. Here's the irony. On the surface, a Roman banquet was about leisure. But underneath, it was pure performance. Guests showed off wit, loyalty, or restraint. Hosts flaunted power with gold, perfumes, and dishes so ridiculous they became legend. Nobody was there just to eat. Everyone was there to be seen. So if you're picturing a cozy dinner, erase it. This wasn't comfort. This was Rome turning a meal into a battlefield of status. And you're lying on that couch, pretending the fish bones in front of you don't mean you're at the bottom of the ladder. The wine is flowing, the music is playing, but the real game has nothing to do with food. So here's the moment. You get the invitation. Or worse, you're the one deciding to throw the banquet. In Rome, that's not a casual, let's grab dinner. It's like being dared to step into a gladiator arena, but with wine instead of swords. If you're the host, the stakes are brutal. A banquet isn't about feeding people. It's a public test of how powerful, generous, and rich you look. Miss the mark, and you're the guy everyone whispers about. Cheap, weak, maybe even broke. Go too far, and you've bankrupted yourself just to impress people who will laugh at you tomorrow. Either way, your reputation is on the chopping block.
If you're the guest, it's no easier. Accepting means you're on display all night long. Decline, and you insult the host. Congratulations, you just made an enemy. And the Romans were petty enough to remember that snub for years. Let me spell it out. One night reclining on a couch could make or break careers. Alliances were forged, favors were won, enemies were put in their place. But you could also end up humiliated, forgotten, or even politically ruined. And here's where it gets funny. Sometimes banquets weren't even private. During festivals like Saturnalia, the whole social order flipped upside down for a day. Masters served slaves, people gambled at the table, and everyone pretended the rules didn't matter. But don't be fooled, that chaos was still controlled by the elites. Even when Rome played at being equal, the powerful still ran the show. Now imagine the debate in your head as a guest. You're invited, you're flattered, but then you start worrying. How long is this thing going to drag on? Will the food be any good, or worse? Will you be stuck in the cheap seats, chewing on scraps while your VIP next to you gets the good meat? And what if you say the wrong thing? You can't exactly sit silently either, because the whole point is conversation. Suddenly, you realize you're walking into a room where every bite, every laugh, every glance is a political move. And the physical side? Don't underestimate it. Reclining while eating looks glamorous in the frescoes, but in reality, it hurts your back. If you're older, or a woman squeezed into the expectation of this posture, it's awkward, maybe even humiliating. Yet you still do it because standing out as unrefined is social suicide. Hosts, meanwhile, are panicking in their own way. The
The silver cups are polished, the mosaics swept clean, the perfumes burning, but behind the curtain there's stress. Banquets cost a fortune. Exotic foods, imported wines, entertainers, slaves running non-stop. Throwing one too often could leave you in debt. And if you cut corners, everyone notices. One mismatched cup, one bland dish, and rumors start, maybe you're not as rich as you pretend. And the truth? Even if you pull it off, someone like Seneca is sitting at home writing essays about how you're proof Rome is morally bankrupt. Imagine knowing half your city thinks your big night is the reason civilization is going downhill.
But it wasn't just about money. The host had to run the night like a general running an army. Food had to come out in the right order, music had to start and stop smoothly, conversation had to flow, and everyone had to feel flattered, but not too flattered. Hosting was theatre. Get the rhythm wrong, and the whole night turned awkward. And once awkwardness hit, it was remembered forever. Guests on their side had homework. You didn't just throw on tenny clothes. Your toga had to be spotless, maybe even newly dyed. Women wore stolas with just the right flash of embroidery. And gifts, you brought them. Not because you wanted to, but because it signaled loyalty. Forget a gift, and you risked looking ungrateful. Then came the mental prep. You rehearsed which topics were safe, which rival to compliment just enough, which powerful man to toast first. You planned your laughs, your nods, even when to look impressed. A single slip of the tongue could ripple out into real political damage. Meanwhile, Rome itself argued endlessly about whether these banquets were noble or disgusting. Philosophers ranted that too much wine and roasted peacock was killing the old Roman values of discipline and simplicity. Cicero wrote that all this feasting made people soft. Yet the banquets kept happening because no one wanted to look poor or powerless. That's Rome for you. Morality could always take a back seat to showing off. And then comes the tipping point. You've worried, you've prepped, you've weighed the risks. But in the end, you go, or you host. There's no halfway. Once you recline on that couch or open your triclinium doors, you've committed. And here's where things get surreal. The banquet world is not everyday Rome. It's an upside-down place where the lights, the smells, the music, and the endless food create a bubble. Politics get disguised as jokes, power plays hide under toasts, and the most dangerous thing you can do is forget you're still being watched. So you break in, you take your seat, or rather, you recline, and suddenly you're trapped in the theater of Roman life. The door shuts, the slaves start pouring wine, and every move from here on out is part of the performance. And here's the real punch. This isn't dinner anymore, it's survival. Close your eyes for a second and put yourself at that table. Candles flickering, the smell of roasted boar, wine spilling everywhere. Could you actually handle this? Or would it be too much? Let me know in the comments section.
Here's the part nobody tells you. A Roman banquet wasn't just about stuffing your face, it was basically linked in with wine and roast boar. Every move at that table screamed who owned power and who begged for it. Think about the host first. He's not feeding you out of kindness, he's your patron, your provider, the guy who expects loyalty in return for that golden goblet of Falernian wine. When he shows off with exotic dishes like peacock tongues or honey dormice, he's really saying, remember who put this in your mouth, remember who you owe. And you? You're the client, the loyal follower. Your job isn't to just eat, it's to clap at the right moment, laugh at the right joke, maybe toss in a flattering line about how the oysters taste fresher than Neptune's own catch. Mess this up, and suddenly you're in with the big man slips. Play it right, and you just secured protection, favors, maybe even political backing. Now here's where it gets wild. Sometimes the real guides weren't even senators or family. They were slaves or freedmen. Picture this. You're a young rookie guest, sweating over whether to sit down before the host does A servant leans in, whispers, "Wait, praise the wine first, then toast him." These behind-the-scenes mentors kept guests from tanking their reputations in a single slip. Imagine needing a coach just to survive dinner. And the whole setup was a mirror of Roman values: power, honor, hospitality. It was all on stage. The host showed power by controlling the food and entertainment, honor by handing the best cuts to his favorites, hospitality by pretending this was all generosity instead of political theater. But here's the funny part. A lot of newbies walked in thinking this was a party. By the end, they realized it was a chessboard. Every laugh, every glance, every scrap of meat was a move in a bigger game. Petronius even mocked this in the Satyricon. Guests who came for fun ended up trapped in a circus of flattery and fear. So yeah, you came for wine and gossip, but you left with your whole social rank stamped on your forehead. And the deeper the night went, the harder it became to forget who actually ran the show.
The night starts long before the food even touches your lips. You don't just stroll into a Roman banquet like it's a casual dinner. No, you show up knowing this is theater. You arrive armed with gifts, maybe a silver cup, maybe something exotic your family could barely afford. And the moment you cross that threshold, you're already being judged. The greetings are ritualized. Everyone's eyes track who bows deeper, who flatters harder, who hesitates too long. The host beams like a god, accepting each offering as if it's tribute. Already, the social chessboard is being set up. And then comes the seating. This is where you realize the real feast isn't about food, it's about rank. Seats aren't equal. The best spot? The locus consularis, the seat of honor, reserved for the highest status guest. Everyone else is arranged in descending order, like a human ladder of power. If you're shoved near the bottom, you feel it burn. One wrong placement can wreck a man's reputation. Imagine being sat next to freedmen while your rival lounges 2 couches over with senators. You'd taste the humiliation more than the wine. And when you finally recline, yes, recline, not sit, it's awkward as hell the first time. Romans thought sitting to eat was for kids and workers. Real men leaned sideways, propped on the left elbow, balancing bread and meat with the right hand. It looked elegant in paintings, sure, but in practice, your back aches, the wine sloshes, and you're praying not to spill sauce on your toga. Women, when allowed, usually sat upright, a reminder of Rome's rigid gender lines. What felt like luxury to the elites was really another coded symbol. We are so free from labor, we don't even sit like you peasants. Now the food parade begins. First, the gustatio. Starters like eggs, salads, or, if the host wants to flex, oysters on a silver tray. Oysters meant wealth. They had to be shipped in from coastal towns, kept alive on the journey. You pop one in your mouth, salty, fresh, and you're already calculating what else is coming if this is just the opener. Then the prima mensa, the main courses. This is where the table turns into a spectacle. Whole roasted boars carved in front of guests, steaming fish drizzled with garum, the infamous fermented fish sauce Romans loved, but foreigners gagged over. The really over-the-top hosts rolled out flamingo tongues, honey-glazed dormice, or exotic spices imported from Asia. Each dish was less about taste and more about screaming, "Look at my connections, look at my empire stretched onto this table."
And the strangest part, you might not even get the good stuff. The distribution of food followed rank too. The inner circle might get the fatty cuts of pork, while you, the nobody guest, gnaw on bones or eat the scraps. Watching your rival sink his teeth into tender venison while you chew something closer to jerky, That stung more than any insult. Dessert, the secunda mensa, finally lightened things up. Figs, dates, cheese, candied nuts. But by then, the point wasn't the food, it was survival. Were you witty enough, subtle enough, visible enough to leave a mark? Or would the night end with you invisible, your chance wasted? And then came the wine. But forget Hollywood images of toga parties with everyone chugging. Romans diluted their wine, often 3 parts water to 1 part wine, and no one drank neat unless they wanted to look barbaric. The symposiac, the drinking master, decided the pace. Too fast, and you risked being sloppy. Too slow, and you looked stiff. Toasts were made, often dripping with forced praise, while younger guests sweated bullets trying to say something clever without offending a senator or sounding like a sycophant. Sometimes, to break the tension, they played games like Cotterboss, where you'd flick wine dregs at a target, hoping to impress with skill. Imagine it, the most powerful men in the empire flicking wine at bowls, like college kids playing beer pong, but with reputations on the line. A bad shot, cue the Snickers. A perfect hit, maybe the host notices and smiles. Every moment was loaded. And just when you thought you could breathe, the entertainment marched in. Flute players, lyres, maybe a water organ if the host had serious money. Poets performed lines from Virgil's Aeneid, while acrobats flipped through torchlight. Dancers spun in gauzy fabrics. Mime troupes mocked familiar stories, sometimes with crude humor. In the wildest cases, gladiators or exotic animals were paraded through because nothing said wealth than a chained leopard pacing in your dining hall. Even the servants weren't silent. Some sang while serving, others cracked jokes or recited memorized poetry. Their voices threaded through the clinking plates and laughter, turning service into part of the spectacle. But don't be fooled. Slaves were the machinery holding this whole circus together. Without them, the feast collapsed. And yet, despite the music, the wine, the roasted boars, the banquets always had an undercurrent of danger. One slip of the tongue in a toast, one ill-timed joke, one political remark overheard by the wrong ear, and your reputation could be gutted faster than the pig on the platter. But here's the cruel irony. The higher the host raised the stakes with rare dishes and flashy acts, the more fragile the night became. Because eventually, all eyes turned to one moment, the climax of the evening, the host's big move, the point where everything could rise into glory or crash in scandal. And you never knew which it would be until it happened. The feast has been rolling for hours now, and the room is thick. Perfume, sweat, roasted meat, smoke from oil lamps. You're buzzed, but not drunk, balancing on that knife edge the symposiarch allows. The music dips, the chatter hushes, and suddenly everyone knows the night has reached its turning point. This is the host's chance to lock his legacy in the minds of every guest. Sometimes it's a speech, long, pompous, heavy with praise for Rome, for the ancestors, for the gods. Other times, it's a display so outrageous it leaves the room stunned. Maybe he unveils a dish from lands so distant the spices cost more than your yearly income. Maybe a troop of gladiators steps into the atrium, weapons gleaming under lamplight. Or maybe, more chillingly, the climax is silence, all eyes waiting for him to bless or curse someone with a word. But here's the razor edge. You never know if the midpoint will crown someone or cut them down. A false victory could make you believe you've won favor. Maybe the host toasts you, your name echoing in front of senators and generals, your cheeks burning with pride. You drink, thinking this night has lifted you into new ranks of power. But that toast, it might be the peak before the crash, because tomorrow everyone remembers how you gushed back, how you looked desperate, how your rivals smirked. Or maybe it's a false defeat. The host ignores you completely. Your rival is praised, you're sidelined, The food tastes like ash. You leave thinking you've been humiliated, but whispers follow. Did you see how he handled himself? And somehow your restraint earns quiet respect. Banquets were cruel like that. What felt like disaster could seed long-term advantage. What felt like triumph could rot into embarrassment.
And then there were the raw social landmines. Spilled wine across the wrong man's toga. Laughter that lasted a second too long. A joke that sounded sharper than intended. Petronius loved these moments in the Satyricon, the tension where a single slip turned feasting into warfare. The drama of the banquet wasn't just staged by the host, it lived in every twitch of conversation, every accidental snub. Think about seating for a second. If a powerful senator noticed he'd been placed too far down the couch, resentment boiled. If a freedman was elevated too high, sneers cut through the room. The midpoint often dragged these slights into the open, sparking rivalries that spilled beyond the walls of the triclinium. You weren't just eating dinner, you were gambling your political skin. For some, this was intoxicating, to trade barbs in verse, to duel with wit while the wine loosened tongues. It was like gladiator combat, but with words. For others, it was suffocating. Pliny's letters drip with irritation about endless banquets, where a man endured hours of bad poetry and stiff politicking just to avoid offending his host. Imagine being trapped there, belly bloated, back aching, ears ringing with flute music, forced to smile through another speech about ancestral virtue. Yet the pressure is what made it matter. At this midpoint, the stakes shot up. Food wasn't food. Wine wasn't wine. Everything was reputation, survival, and power disguised in silk and honey. If the night ended now, your position in the Roman world might already be shifting. One nod, one toast, one insult lingered long after the couches were cleared. And it wasn't just external politics. Inside, something shifted too. This was the moment guests often realized the banquet wasn't pleasure, it was performance. You came in thinking it was a party, maybe even a chance to indulge. By the midpoint, the mask cracked. You saw the machinery, the slaves orchestrating every move, the host's smile calculated to remind you of your place. The hierarchy pressed into the seating, into the food, into your very posture. That realization could sour the sweetest wine. You laugh at the joke, but feel hollow. You nibble the figs, but can't shake the sense you've been measured, weighed, and filed into a category you can't escape. Some guests embraced this awareness, playing the game sharper, climbing where they could. Others recoiled, disgusted at the hypocrisy, secretly longing for simpler meals, where bread was just bread.
And yet the banquet demanded you keep performing. You couldn't check out. Your role was live, judged in real time. Even as music swelled again and dancers returned, the knowledge stayed. This was no feast, it was a battlefield without swords, where the wounds were invisible, but the scars lasted just as long. That's why Roman writers obsessed over this moment. They knew that under the glitter of couches and silver plates, the true drama pulsed, ambition clashing with humiliation, honor with shame, survival with spectacle. This point was the soul of the banquet, the place where luxury became politics, and politics became personal. By the time dessert arrives, the laughter feels louder but also sharper. Everyone's smiling, but everyone's watching. And you realize the banquet isn't winding down, it's only twisting tighter. Because if this was the midpoint, then the second half is where consequences really bite. All right, imagine Rome hands you one ticket,
You either live as a noble, drowning in debts and politics, or as a servant, invisible but trapped in endless work. No middle ground. Which one are you taking? Let me know in the comments section. The wine keeps flowing, but the joy is gone. What started as laughter now feels forced, brittle, strained. Somewhere between the third and fourth course, the feast stops tasting like abundance and starts tasting like punishment. The Romans knew this stage. Overindulgence was practically ritualized. Seneca wrote like a man watching society eat itself alive, raging against bloated bellies and staggering drunkards. And he wasn't exaggerating. Guests were pushed to gorge until they nearly burst. Ever heard of vomitoria? No, not the exits in amphitheaters. That's a modern myth. In elite banquets, a vomitorium was literal. Guests purged on purpose, sticking fingers down their throats so they could keep shoveling food down. Imagine a room of powerful men, their throats raw from vomiting, stumbling back to couches to keep drinking as if nothing had happened. Rome called that civilization. And the worst part? Overindulgence wasn't just disgusting, it was dangerous. Alcohol poisoning, food poisoning, stomachs rupturing, guests dropping dead at the table. Suetonius loved to point fingers. Emperors poisoning rivals, sons poisoned by their own mothers. Whether true or propaganda, the banquet became the perfect stage for suspicion. That cup of wine, a gift or a weapon. That fig, sweet or fatal. Every bite carried risk.
Meanwhile, the politics turned sharper. A smile from across the couch could be genuine, or it could be a warning. Rivals slipped poison not just into goblets, but into conversations. A toast with the wrong wording, a joke with a barbed edge, gossip whispered a little too loudly, all subtle knives aimed at reputations. Domitian once staged an entire black banquet, dimming the room, dressing everything in funerary black, making his guests eat under the shadow of death just to remind them who held power. This wasn't dinner, it was domination. And you could screw it up without meaning to. Seating was a minefield. Too close to the host and you looked arrogant, too far down and you looked irrelevant. Misread the hierarchy and suddenly you'd insulted a senator or angered a general. One wrong laugh, one careless word, and you weren't just embarrassed, you were marked. Ovid warned about this in his love manuals of all places. Etiquette mistakes could destroy you faster than any sword. Even the slaves watched, and that was its own danger. They weren't just silent hands carrying trays, they were eyes, ears, informants. A glance exchanged with the wrong freedman, a careless remark muttered when the wine was heavy. By morning, it could be repeated to your rival, or even back to the host. You never really knew who was loyal. But the real spiral? Money. Hosting these spectacles cost fortunes. Exotic animals, imported wines, spices dragged over deserts and seas. Entertainers, gladiators, acrobats, it all drained coin faster than rain through sand. Pliny mentions men who bankrupt themselves on a single feast, their estates bleeding dry just to keep up appearances. Look at Apicius, the infamous gourmet. He blew through his immense fortune trying to outdo himself in luxury. When he realized he was finally broke, he killed himself rather than face a life without excess. That's how deep the addiction ran, feast or die. And yet the crowd pretended it was normal. Guests kept eating, kept laughing, even as their stomachs cramped and their faces flushed. Hosts kept spending even as debts dragged them toward ruin. Slaves kept pouring even as their hands shook under the weight of trays and the stench of vomit filled the corners of the room. Everyone played their part because stepping out of line was worse than sickness, worse than debt, worse than death.
Here's the human truth. Excess has a way of showing you the rot beneath the gold. The longer the banquet went on, the more the cracks spread. Guests who arrived proud and polished now sweated through their tunics, slurred their words, slopped their wine. Senators who began the night as gods of the Republic ended it looking like pigs at a trough. If you'd walked in fresh, you'd see not power, not grace,
but a mob of men destroying themselves with food and fear. And inside, you'd feel it too, that shift from awe to disgust. At first, the silver platters and roasted peacocks dazzled you. Now they look obscene. At first, the music and laughter charmed you. Now it all feels shrill, desperate, ugly. You catch yourself thinking, is this what Rome calls greatness? Is this what we're all fighting for? That's when the pressure gets unbearable. You realize you can't leave, not yet. You have to keep enduring the poison, the politics, the hollow laughter, because the banquet isn't over. And if you misstep now, if you collapse, vomit too visibly, speak too boldly, you don't just ruin the night, you ruin your future. So you sit there, tasting bile, watching the smiles sharpen around you. You wonder if the next cup will lift you or kill you. And deep down, you know the truth. Nobody leaves this room untouched. Everyone loses something before the night is done. By this point, the banquet is swollen with excess. The air reeks of sweat, wine, and the sour tang of vomit masked by perfumes. The candles gutter low, shadows crawl across the walls, and the whole room feels like it's teetering on the edge of collapse. And then it happens. The moment where everything turns. Rome's greatest gatherings often ended not in triumph, but in chaos. Sometimes the spark was small. A servant drops a jug. A guest makes a joke at the wrong senator's expense. A toast goes sour. But in the pressure cooker of a Roman feast, even a slip of wine on the host's couch could become a public scandal. The wrong laugh could brand you an enemy. The wrong silence could look like contempt. Etiquette wasn't just a formality here, it was survival. Other times, the disasters were lethal. Banquets were the perfect stage for assassination. Suetonius tells us of poison slipped into goblets, figs, or mushrooms, the so-called food of the gods that became a weapon of choice.
Rumors swirled about Claudius's son dying this way, and Caligula's dinners became infamous for cruelty and sudden executions. Imagine being invited to dine, then realizing too late that the man feeding you considered you disposable. And it wasn't just poison. Fights broke out too, over politics, over honor, over seating. A sneer turned into a shove into a knife. Rome's elite never really left their daggers behind. They just hid them under the table until the right moment. The feast could end with blood on the mosaic floor, the music strangled mid-note by screams. Even when no one died, reputations did. A man too drunk to hold himself upright became a story whispered in every forum the next day. A host who failed to provide enough food or whose entertainment fell flat risked ridicule that could cripple his social standing. In a city obsessed with spectacle, failure at the banquet meant failure everywhere. The financial fallout was just as brutal. Some hosts spent themselves into ruin, convinced that one more extravagant night would secure their legacy. Instead, they woke up drowning in debts. Apicius's suicide is the most famous, but he wasn't alone. Pliny tells us of men who lost estates and titles over banquets, their families broken on the wheel of keeping up appearances. That was the unspoken terror in every guest's mind. This abundance wasn't sustainable. It was a performance on credit, and credit always comes due. And then there were the emotional collapses. Beneath the gold and laughter, anxiety ate at the guests. They knew they were performing, knew their every bite, every word was being judged. Seneca saw it clearly. Banquets didn't just corrupt the body, they hollowed out the soul. What looked like joy was really desperation. Men terrified of losing relevance, power, or face. Strip away the silk and jewels, and you didn't see gods reclining. you saw prisoners locked in invisible chains of expectation. By the final course, the secunda mensa, the masks had slipped. Fruits, nuts, and honeycakes sat untouched, wine spilled freely, but the atmosphere was sour. Some guests were too bloated to eat, others too drunk to speak. A few slipped quietly out, hoping not to be noticed. But most stayed, trapped by the ritual, waiting for the host's final performance. That climax could be dazzling, a speech praising ancestors, a surprise gladiator match, a parade of exotic beasts, or humiliating. Caligula once handed out bread to nobles as though they were beggars. Domitian terrified senators with his funeral-themed feast. The same space that promised glory could deliver ruin, depending entirely on the host's whim and the guest's ability to endure.
And then came the lowest moment, the symbolic death that every great feast seemed to hold. Sometimes it was literal, a guest collapsing in vomit, poisoned rivals gasping their last breaths, a brawl ending with a corpse sprawled across the triclinium. Other times it was social. A man laughed out of the room, a host whispered about as a fraud, a noble stripped of dignity before the very peers whose respect he craved. That was the trap of the Roman banquet. It promised immortality through spectacle, but more often delivered death. Of body, of reputation, of self-respect. By dawn, when the oil lamps had burned out and the slaves dragged the last carcasses of food away, what remained wasn't triumph. It was exhaustion, shame, fear. Picture leaving such a feast, your breath sour, your stomach knotted, your head pounding. You glance over your shoulder at the villa glowing faintly in the night. Did you rise tonight or fall? Were you seen as witty, loyal, impressive, or pathetic, arrogant, forgettable? You don't know. You only know the banquet isn't over. It never is. The gossip will outlast the food. The debts will outlast the wine. And the scars, whether on your body or your reputation, will follow you long after the torches go out. That is Rome's darkest truth. What looked like celebration was often the beginning of decay. Every laugh covered a threat, every toast hid a risk, every course brought you closer to ruin. And in the end, the banquet always consumed more than it gave. The banquet always feels invincible in the moment, gold cups clinking, laughter swelling, every glance a chess move. But what comes after? That's when the silence hits. When the wine is gone, when the torches gutter out, you're left with the aftertaste of excess, and it's bitter. Ancient writers knew this rhythm: feast, shine, regret. The stomach aches. The alliances formed under candlelight suddenly look fragile in the cold light of morning. The triumph of being admired turns into the dread of being watched too closely. Imagine pouring months of income into one night just to keep up appearances, then realizing you've bought yourself more enemies than friends. That's the come down. For some Romans, this wasn't just a hangover, it was a reckoning. The philosophers, especially the Stoics, hammered at the same warning: indulgence makes you weak, and weakness makes you prey.
Seneca in particular framed luxury as a kind of betrayal, not just of your body, but of your soul. And you can feel why his words hit. When you've seen the masks slip at 3 a.m, when you've tasted the stale bread after the silver platters, you start to suspect the entire system is rotten. And here's the twist. This isn't just abstract moralizing. People felt it. Hosts sat awake calculating debts, the exact number of favors they owed, the precise enemies they'd angered by seating them too far from the wine. Guests replayed every joke, every smirk, wondering who had marked them as foolish or desperate. That gnawing regret was the real cost of the banquet, an erosion of certainty, of self. But in that darkness, there's also a spark. The moment of clarity where the host, whether lavish host or ambitious guest, sees the machinery for what it is. The banquet isn't just food and performance, it's a trap, a stage that consumes those who forget the difference between power and pretense. And from that spark comes a choice. Either keep running on the treadmill of spectacle, burning yourself out for one more round of applause, or step off. Redefine what victory looks like. Find a way to navigate the same game without selling your soul to it. That's the crack in the facade where change gets in. The banquet begins with fire and noise, but it never ends that way. By the time you've seen the cycle, hunger, excess, regret, there's no illusion left. And for our host, the moment of reckoning has already passed. They've stared into the hollow eyes of the feast, seen how easily abundance turns into poison, and realized they can't keep living the same way. So what now? That's the question. The answer isn't to run away from the banquet altogether. That's cowardice, and in Rome, cowardice is its own kind of death. The answer is sharper. To step back into that room of silver trays and calculating smiles, but this time as someone different. Someone who knows the game, but won't be consumed by it. The change doesn't look dramatic from the outside. The hall still fills with the perfume of roasted meat. The torches still flicker over polished cups. But you suddenly make a decision. No more desperate overindulgence. No more scrambling for applause. They've decided that the banquet will no longer own them.
Imagine walking into a dinner where every guest measures you by what you serve, how many couches you fill, how much wine you pour. Normally, the host cracks under that pressure. They order one more platter of oysters, one more round of exotic delicacies, and with every course, their fortune bleeds out on the marble floor. This time, the host reins it in. They choose restraint, not because they can't do excess, but because they could and won't. That's power. This is a kind of quiet rebellion, not a refusal to play the game, but a refusal to play it blindly. Seneca would have called it virtue. Today, we just call it self-respect. The banquet has always been about people as much as plates, and with restraint comes another test: what to do with the bruised alliances left in the wake of earlier excess. Those long silences, the friend who felt insulted by where they were seated, the rival who smelled weakness in your overextension. And sometimes the host decides not to rush to fix everyone. That's the old way, throwing wine and gifts at the problem, praying it buys forgiveness. Instead, they choose carefully. They extend a hand where trust can still be rebuilt, and they let other ties burn away. Not every relationship deserves saving. And in Rome, knowing who not to trust is often as valuable as loyalty itself. There's a grim wisdom in that. You learn it the hard way after too many nights of forced smiles across the table. With this new clarity, the host doesn't vanish into obscurity. Quite the opposite. They begin to play the game smarter. Invitations are still sent, but the guest list is smaller. The food is simpler, the flow of wine steadier, but not endless. What's lost in spectacle is gained in intimacy. And people notice. Some sneer, what happened to the grand displays, the fountains of fish sauce, the bread sculpted into miniature battles. But others lean closer. They see a different kind of authority, a host who isn't panicked into overcompensation, a figure who knows their worth
without needing to set the room on fire to prove it. This recalibration isn't just survival, it's growth. It's the realization that status isn't about the loudest night, but the longest-lasting respect. And in the cutthroat social ecosystem of Rome, longevity is everything. Now picture the final scene. The couches are arranged, but the room feels calmer. There's no frantic parade of courses. Instead, the food comes in balance. Rich, yes, but not overwhelming.
Conversation rises naturally, not forced. For the first time, the banquet feels like what it pretended to be all along, a gathering of minds, not just mouths. A place where alliances can be built without drowning them in wine, where friendship can grow in measured laughter, not in desperate displays. The irony? By dialing it back, by stripping away the noise, the host has created the most memorable banquet of all, not because of its success, but because of its restraint. Of course, not everyone in Rome learned this lesson. Imperial courts would still explode with gold and silk. Emperors would still gorge themselves in spectacles designed to dwarf the Republic's memory of frugality. But individuals did adapt. In times of political upheaval or famine, some shifted towards simpler feasts. Some rediscovered the old Republican virtue of moderation, not as nostalgia, but as necessity. The host stands in that space between the grandeur of empire and the moral tug of restraint, a walking symbol of what the banquet could be and what Rome itself was wrestling with. Remember the opening? The blinding glitter of a hall groaning with food, a performance so loud it drowned out the people inside it. That was the world the host first entered. Dazzling, dangerous, intoxicating. Now the image has changed. A smaller table. Candles burning low. The laughter feels real this time, not sharpened by competition. The host sits not at the head, not above the crowd, but among their guests, present, awake. It's not less powerful, it's more, because it proves they're no longer owned by the ritual. They've mastered it. And that's the point of the story. The banquet wasn't just a meal. It was a mirror, showing what power does to people, how easily hunger turns to vanity, and how hard it is to step off the treadmill of appearances. But the journey isn't just Rome's. Look around. We're still feasting in our own ways, still flashing status, still exhausting ourselves, chasing validation. Maybe the Romans weren't so different from us after all. Maybe the lesson hasn't aged a day. So when the final candle flickers out, the image that stays with you isn't the gold or the wine. It's the choice. The moment someone decided to stop letting the feast define them and instead to define the feast. That's the true victory. Don't drift off just yet. The fire's still burning, and I've got one more tale waiting for you.